July 14th, 1944. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. The bleachers creaked under the weight of 300 men in faded Wehrmacht grey. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat rigid in the third row, squinting against the high desert sun as two teams of American soldiers warmed up below. A leather ball snapped between gloves with sounds that carried across the diamond. Someone behind him laughed. The sound felt wrong. Hartmann had been captured 6 weeks earlier in the hedgerows of Normandy, processed through a facility in Virginia, and deposited here among the mesas and scrub pine of southern Colorado. The war he knew, the war of burning tanks and artillery barrages that turned earth to soup, existed now only in memory and in letters from home that arrived sporadically through the Red Cross. Those letters described a different kind of war. Cities reduced to skeletal ruins. Nights spent in cellars while bombers droned overhead. His mother's last letter had mentioned that their street in Essen no longer existed. Here, vendors moved through the crowd selling Coca-Cola for 5 cents. The American guard who had escorted them from the compound now stood at the fence line, rifle slung casually over one shoulder, attention fixed on the game about to begin. Hartmann tried to reconcile these two realities and found the task impossible. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The game began with ceremonies that felt foreign to the Germans watching. A bugle played what the Americans called their national anthem. Hartmann and his fellow prisoners remained seated while the Americans stood. Then came the cry Hartmann had heard repeated during practice sessions in the camp, a phrase that seemed to encapsulate something fundamental about these people. Play ball. The pitcher wound up. The crack of bat meeting ball echoed off the mountains to the west. Men ran. The crowd roared. Hartmann felt a pressure building behind his eyes. Somewhere over Germany, at this precise moment, formations of 4-engine bombers were likely assembling for another daylight raid. His younger brother served with an anti-aircraft battery outside Hamburg. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Every hour he sat here watching Americans play their incomprehensible game. Men died in skies over his homeland. Baseball had come to the German prisoner of war camps across America, not as punishment but as recreation. The office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw the 425,000 German military personnel detained in the United States, operated under strict Geneva Convention guidelines, requiring treatment equivalent to that afforded American military personnel. This meant 40 square feet of living space per enlisted man. This meant wages paid for labor performed. This meant recreational facilities and equipment. The Young Men's Christian Association shipped thousands of pieces of sporting equipment to the camps, including baseball gloves, bats, and the peculiar hard leather balls these Americans hit with such enthusiasm. For many German prisoners, baseball represented their first sustained encounter with American normalcy. They had expected labor camps. They had expected hardship. What they found instead was a nation operating as if the war were happening on another planet entirely. The contrast with conditions in the Reich was so stark that some prisoners initially suspected propaganda or psychological manipulation. The truth was simpler and more devastating. America possessed resources on a scale that rendered the entire European conflict a regional disturbance in a much larger industrial narrative. Hartmann watched the game with the attention of a man trying to decode an alien language. The rules seemed simultaneously simple and Byzantine. Hit the ball, run in a circle, don't get tagged. Yet the Americans in the stands reacted to subtle developments he could not parse. They cheered when a batter stood still and let a pitch pass, untouched. They groaned when a fielder caught a ball that seemed uncatchable. The entire enterprise felt designed to emphasize American abundance. They had time for this. They had materials for this. They had the organizational surplus to stage elaborate recreational events for enemy soldiers, while simultaneously fielding the largest military force in human history. The statistics told their own story. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 98,000 bomber aircraft of all types. 32,000 of these were heavy bombers, primarily Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators. The B-17 alone accounted for 12,731 aircraft by the time production ceased in May of 1945. The B-24, built at Ford's Willow Run facility and other plants, reached 18,493 examples. At peak production, American factories delivered one heavy bomber every 63 minutes. German industrial planners had calculated that the Reich could sustain a war of attrition against Britain and the Soviet Union. Those calculations had not accounted for an American economy that treated military production as a secondary concern while simultaneously maintaining civilian prosperity. The German prisoners working in Colorado's sugar beet fields, picking cotton in Texas, or cutting timber in the Pacific Northwest witnessed this firsthand. They worked alongside American farmers who drove new trucks, who complained about rationing that would have seemed like luxury to German civilians, who spoke casually about sons and brothers serving overseas as if military service were an inconvenience rather than an existential struggle. Camp Trinidad housed 2,500 German prisoners at its peak, with branch camps scattered across southern Colorado providing labor for agriculture and light industry. The main compound followed standard design specifications: barracks capable of housing 50 men each, mess halls serving food prepared according to German preferences when possible, barbed wire fences topped with lights that burned through the mountain nights, guard towers with searchlights and machine guns that were rarely used because escape attempts were few and usually short-lived. Where would a German soldier run in the middle of Colorado? The nearest Wehrmacht unit was 5,000 miles away across an ocean patrolled by Allied navies that had long since established complete maritime dominance. The psychological impact of captivity in America differed fundamentally from that experienced by American prisoners in German camps. American POWs in Europe faced genuine privation. Red Cross parcels provided essential calories. Escape attempts, while rarely successful, represented both duty and desperate hope. German prisoners in America faced a different kind of hardship. They had enough food, they had adequate shelter, they had medical care that often exceeded what German civilians received at home. What they lacked was any framework for processing their situation. Hartmann remembered his capture. The American infantry had surrounded his position in a Norman orchard. An officer had called out in accented German, offering surrender with a guarantee of fair treatment. Hartmann and his squad had exhausted their ammunition. The choice was surrender or pointless death. They had chosen surrender, expecting brutality or at least harsh conditions. Instead, they had received medical attention, hot coffee, and cigarettes. Within 48 hours, they were behind the lines, being processed through a system so efficient it felt mechanical. Then came the Atlantic crossing in the hold of a Liberty ship returning empty from England. Then came the trains, clean Pullman cars that carried them west through a landscape so vast and untouched by war that several prisoners had wept at the sight of it. The baseball game continued. The Americans playing seemed younger than Hartmann, though he was only 23 himself. They moved with an ease he associated with peacetime, with the years before 1939, when young men played sports without calculating the probability of death. One of the players hit the ball with particular force. It soared over the outfield fence, prompting a roar from the crowd. The player trotted around the bases, touching each one in sequence, while teammates lined up to slap his back as he crossed home plate. The ritual felt ancient and frivolous simultaneously. Behind Hartmann, a prisoner named Schroeder spoke in low tones. "They have no idea what is happening over there." Schroeder came from Dresden. His letters from home had recently stopped arriving. "They sit here drinking their Coca-Colas while our cities burn." Hartmann said nothing. Schroeder was not entirely correct. The Americans knew what was happening. They planned it. They executed it. The combined bomber offensive, initiated in January of 1943 at the Casablanca Conference, represented the most sustained application of strategic air power in history. British Royal Air Force Bomber Command attacked German cities by night, with area bombing designed to destroy industrial capacity and break civilian morale. The United States 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, conducted precision daylight raids against specific military and industrial targets. Together, the two forces mounted round-the-clock operations that subjected Germany to bombing on a scale unprecedented in warfare. The numbers told a story of industrial capacity translated directly into destructive power. Between 1942 and 1945, Allied bombers dropped nearly 2.7 million tons of ordnance on Germany. The United States Army Air Forces alone delivered 1,050,000 tons. British Bomber Command contributed 989,000 tons. These raids flew 1,440,000 bomber sorties and 2,680,000 fighter escort sorties. They cost 79,265 American lives and 79,281 British lives. They destroyed 3,600,000 German dwellings, killed an estimated 300,000 civilians, wounded 780,000 more, and rendered 7.5 million people homeless. Hartmann knew these facts, only in outline. He knew that when he left Germany in early June, the air raids had become so frequent that his family spent more nights in the cellar than in their beds. He knew that the Krupp works in Essen, where his father had worked before conscription took him to the Eastern Front, operated now in dispersed facilities to minimize damage from any single raid. He knew that the Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 41, now struggled to mount effective defense against bomber streams that numbered in the hundreds of aircraft. What he could not know, sitting in the Colorado sun watching baseball, was the strategic calculus that made his captivity in comfort possible while his homeland burned. The American strategy rested on assumptions about industrial warfare that the Germans had failed to anticipate. The United States had entered the war with an economy already mobilized for production. Lend-Lease deliveries to Britain and the Soviet Union had begun before Pearl Harbor, establishing supply chains and manufacturing protocols that would scale exponentially once America entered the conflict directly. By 1943, American industrial output exceeded that of Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. This surplus allowed the United States to wage total war on multiple fronts while maintaining domestic prosperity that bordered on the surreal when viewed from European perspectives. The German prisoners at Camp Trinidad worked 6 days per week when agricultural labor was available. They earned 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, which they spent on cigarettes, chocolate, and other commissary items. The work was demanding but not brutal. American farmers, facing severe labor shortages as their sons and hired hands went to war, treated the German prisoners as valuable workers rather than defeated enemies. Many prisoners formed relationships with the families they worked for, relationships that sometimes continued through correspondence after the war. These interactions provided glimpses into American life that propaganda had not prepared them for. One prisoner, writing in a journal that later found its way into historical archives, described his bewilderment at American abundance. "The farmer I work for complains about rationing, but his children are fat and his wife wears new dresses. His barn holds equipment worth more than my father earned in a lifetime. He owns land that extends to the horizon. He speaks of the war as an inconvenience. When I told him my city no longer exists, he said he was sorry and offered me another sandwich." The baseball game reached its midpoint. The Americans called this the seventh inning stretch. Everyone stood and sang a song about buying peanuts and Cracker Jack. Hartmann stood because everyone else did. The words meant nothing to him, but the ritual's casual joy felt like a weapon. These people possessed the power to destroy his civilization, and they celebrated with songs about snacks. The juxtaposition was unbearable. The combined bomber offensive represented more than military strategy. It embodied a fundamental difference in how America and Germany understood modern war. German doctrine, forged in the trenches of the Great War, and refined through the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 41, focused on concentration of force at decisive points. German military theory sought battle of annihilation, the Kesselschlacht, that would destroy enemy armies in the field and force political capitulation. American doctrine, particularly in the air, pursued industrial attrition. break the enemy's capacity to wage war by destroying the factories, the refineries, the transportation networks that sustained military operations. The American approach required industrial capacity that Germany simply did not possess and could not match. In March of 1943, Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force initiated the Battle of the Ruhr. Over 5 months, they dropped 34,000 tons of bombs on Germany's industrial heartland. Steel production fell by 200,000 tons, creating a shortfall of 400,000 tons. Reich's Minister Albert Speer, responsible for German armaments production, acknowledged that the raids disrupted his plans to increase output. Between July of 1943 and March of 1944, German aircraft production plateaued despite Speer's efforts to disperse manufacturing into smaller facilities less vulnerable to bombing. The bombing of Hamburg in July of 1943, Operation Gomorrah, demonstrated what massed incendiary attacks could achieve. The resulting firestorm killed 42,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city centre. Hartmann had been in training when Hamburg burned. He remembered the whispers among the recruits, the rumours of a new kind of horror. But training continued. Orders came down. The Wehrmacht needed replacements. Young men like Hartmann learned infantry tactics and were shipped to France to wait for the invasion everyone knew was coming. When it came, at Normandy in early June, the scale of Allied material superiority became immediately apparent. The bombardment preceding the landings had sounded like the earth splitting open. The aircraft overhead had been so numerous that veterans of the Eastern Front stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Then came the landings themselves, a logistical feat that defied comprehension. How many tons of supplies did it take to put that many men on a beach and keep them supplied? How many ships? How many factories working? How many shifts? Now Hartmann sat in Colorado watching baseball while formations of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds assembled over England for another mission. The 8th Air Force typically launched raids with 300 to 600 bombers, escorted by an equal or greater number of fighters. Each bomber carried anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 pounds of ordnance, depending on target distance and defensive requirements. Each mission represented an industrial effort, equivalent to a small city's entire economic output. The Americans launched these missions daily when weather permitted. They could afford losses that would cripple German operations. When a bomber went down, another rolled off a production line in Michigan or California to replace it. When a crew was lost, another finished training in Texas or Arizona. The baseball game entered its final innings. The score appeared close, judging by the crowd's tension. An American batter swung and missed 3 times, prompting groans. Another hit the ball sharply, driving in 2 runners. The crowd erupted. Hartmann felt himself being pulled into the drama despite his intention to remain detached. The game possessed its own logic, its own tensions. For brief moments, he forgot where he was and why. Then he remembered, and the guilt was crushing. Schroeder leaned forward. "How long do you think the war will last?" Hartmann considered the question. The invasion had succeeded. That much was clear even to prisoners isolated from direct news. The Red Army was grinding westward. Allied bombers operated with near impunity. And here he sat, well-fed and watching sports, while the Reich collapsed. "Not long," he said finally. "Months, maybe a year. What happens to us then?" Hartmann had no answer. The Geneva Convention specified repatriation after hostilities ceased. But to what would they return? The letters from home described devastation. His mother's last letter had mentioned that food came now in tiny rations, that fuel for heating was nearly impossible to obtain, that the authorities talked about wonder weapons, but nobody believed them anymore. The gap between propaganda and reality had grown too wide to bridge with slogans. The final out came. One team celebrated. The other walked off the field in dejection that seemed performative compared to the genuine despair Hartmann associated with military defeat. The crowd began to disperse. The German prisoners stood and formed up for the march back to the compound. Guards moved into position, though the rifles stayed shouldered. Escape was not a concern. Where would they go? As they walked back toward the barbed wire, Hartmann looked west toward the mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks, American factories operated 3 shifts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, turning out bombers and tanks and shells at a rate that beggared the imagination. Somewhere over the Atlantic, convoys carried endless streams of supplies and equipment toward Europe. And somewhere over Germany, right now in the late afternoon there, bombers were dropping their loads on targets that might include his city, his street, his family's cellar. The contrast between his present comfort and their suffering felt obscene. But more obscene still was the realization that his captors could afford to treat him well precisely because they possessed such overwhelming material advantage. Treating prisoners humanely cost nothing. Mounting massive bombing campaigns cost everything, and America could afford everything. That was the lesson of the baseball game. Whether the Americans staging it understood or not, they had resources to spare. They could give enemy soldiers an afternoon of entertainment while simultaneously destroying enemy cities. The abundance was the weapon. The generosity was demonstration of power. Back in the compound, Hartmann lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Outside, other prisoners played cards or wrote letters. The sound of their voices, speaking German in the heart of America, created cognitive dissonance all its own. They were prisoners of war, yet they lived better than most civilians in Germany. They were defeated enemies, yet they received treatment that respected their dignity. They were expendable components of a losing war machine, yet they worked for wages and attended baseball games. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and purple. Somewhere to the east, dawn was breaking over Europe. The bombers would be coming home from night raids, or preparing for day raids, or being loaded with ordnance for the next mission. The cycle never stopped, the pressure never relented. And here, in a camp in Colorado, 300 German soldiers slept in warm bunks with full stomachs, the war reduced to an abstraction, a memory, a guilt. Hartmann closed his eyes and saw the baseball game replaying behind his eyelids. The crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd, the casual abundance of it all. Tomorrow he would work in the fields. Tomorrow the sun would rise. Tomorrow the war would continue without him. And tomorrow night he would receive another letter, or he would not, and he would continue trying to reconcile 2 realities that should not coexist but somehow did. The mathematics of industrial war permitted no other outcome. America could build a bomber every hour and stage baseball games for prisoners. Germany could build fighters and anti-aircraft guns, but could not match the production. The outcome was written in the numbers, in the factories, in the very fact that German prisoners sat in American camps while American bombers flew over German cities. Hartmann understood this now in a way he had not understood it on the beaches of Normandy. Defeat was not a military matter. It was an economic inevitability, a calculation made by production managers and logistics officers long before the first shot was fired. He fell asleep finally, and dreamed of baseball and bombs and the strange mathematics of a war where his captors could afford to be generous, precisely because their capacity for destruction was so complete. The weeks became months. Summer heat gave way to autumn chill in the high desert. Hartmann worked the sugar beet harvest, back-breaking labor that left his hands raw and his muscles screaming. The American farmer who supervised his work crew spoke little German, but communicated through gesture and demonstration. The man was perhaps 50, too old for military service, running his farm with the help of prisoners because his sons were overseas, one fighting in Italy, another in the Pacific. The farmer showed Hartmann photographs, young men in uniform, smiling for the camera. Hartmann had no photographs. Everything had been left behind in France. During the lunch break one day in October, the farmer turned on a radio that sat on the truck's dashboard. News in English. Hartmann understood only fragments, but certain words transcended language. Berlin was one of them. Bombing was another. The farmer shook his head and said something that might have been sympathy. Then he offered Hartmann half a sandwich, white bread, ham, cheese, food his mother would have considered a feast. Hartmann ate it and felt the guilt like a physical weight. The strategic bombing campaign had entered a new phase by autumn of 1944. Operation Point Blank, the systematic targeting of German aircraft production and Luftwaffe fighter strength, had achieved its primary objectives. German fighter pilot attrition had reached 90%. In May of that year, the Luftwaffe lost 489 trained pilots, while training centres produced only 396 replacements. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June, the Luftwaffe could manage only 80 operational aircraft on the North French coast, managing approximately 250 combat sorties against 13,743 Allied sorties on D-Day alone. With air superiority established, Allied bombers shifted focus to oil production and transportation networks. The oil campaign, initiated in earnest in September of 1944, targeted synthetic fuel plants and refineries across Germany and occupied territories. Germany's war economy ran on coal-derived synthetic fuel produced through Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius hydrogenation processes. These plants, located primarily in the Ruhr and Silesia, represented identifiable choke points in German military logistics. Systematic attacks on these facilities began to strangle Wehrmacht mobility. Panzer divisions ran out of fuel. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Reichsminister Speer would later report to Hitler that the German economy was heading for inevitable collapse within 4 to 8 weeks of the oil campaign's intensification. Hartmann learned these details only later, after the war, when historians compiled the statistics and strategic assessments. In the autumn of 1944, he knew only what the letters told him. His mother wrote that the raids came now every day and every night without pause, that the neighbourhood civil defence had given up trying to extinguish fires and focused instead on rescue, that her sister's family had been killed when their apartment building took a direct hit, that food rations had been cut again, that everyone whispered about the end but no one spoke it aloud for fear of the authorities. The letters arrived irregularly, delayed by military censors and the chaos of a transportation system under constant attack. Sometimes 3 would arrive in a single day, sometimes none would come for weeks. Each envelope represented a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of deteriorating conditions that Hartmann could do nothing to alleviate. His father's letters from the Eastern Front had stopped arriving in August. No one mentioned this directly, but the silence carried its own message. In November, the camp commander authorized a football match between German prisoners and American guards. Not American football, which remained incomprehensible to the Germans, but soccer played on a makeshift pitch behind the barracks. The Germans won 7-3. The Americans took the defeat with good humour that felt genuine. After the match, both teams shared beer provided by the camp commissary. Hartmann stood at the edge of the gathering, watching men who should have been enemies laughing together over a game. The absurdity of it was absolute. An American guard named Morrison approached him. Morrison was perhaps 30, spoke a few words of German, and had treated the prisoners with consistent fairness since Hartmann's arrival. "Good match," Morrison said in English. Then, attempting German, "Gut Spiel." Hartmann nodded. In halting English learned from camp classes, he responded, "Thank you." Morrison seemed to want to say more. He gestured eastward, toward Germany 5,000 miles away. Bad business, the bombing, war is hell for everyone. Hartmann found no words adequate to the moment. Morrison meant well. But the American could return to a home untouched by war. Morrison's family faced rationing and worry, not rubble and fire. The equivalence Morrison was attempting to draw did not exist, yet Hartmann appreciated the attempt at humanity. He nodded again and said nothing. The Christmas season arrived with snow in the mountains. The camp organized a celebration. Trees were cut and decorated. The prisoners sang carols that reminded them of homes most would likely never see again in their remembered forms. The American command provided a special meal: turkey, potatoes, vegetables, pie, luxuries that made some prisoners weep openly. Hartmann ate mechanically, thinking of his mother eating whatever rations she could obtain, thinking of cities across Germany where Christmas would be marked in cellars and ruins. Letters arrived in a bundle just before New Year's. His mother's handwriting had become shaky. The paper was thin and rationed. Her words were carefully chosen to pass censors but carried meanings between the lines. The factory where she worked assembling small parts for artillery fuses had been destroyed in a raid. She had survived by chance, having stayed home that day with illness. Her friends had not been so fortunate. The authorities were talking about evacuating women and children to rural areas, but there was no transportation and nowhere to go. She asked if he was well. She asked if he had enough to eat. She asked when he thought he might come home. Hartmann wrote back, lying about conditions to spare her additional worry. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that he was treated fairly. He wrote that the war would end soon and they would be together again. He did not write that he had gained weight from the American food. He did not write that he slept in a warm bed every night. He did not write that he had attended a baseball game and found himself, against all reason, invested in its outcome. These truths felt like betrayals. In January of 1945, the tempo of the bombing campaign over Germany reached its peak. The 8th Air Force regularly launched missions with 800 or more bombers. British Bomber Command's night raids employed similar numbers of Lancasters and Halifaxes. The raids targeted not only industrial facilities but also transportation choke points, rail yards, bridges, canals. The German economy, already strained by years of total war, began to fracture under sustained attack. Coal could not reach factories, finished weapons could not reach frontline units, civilians could not be evacuated from threatened areas because the rail network was cratering under bombardment. The prisoners at Camp Trinidad followed the war's progress through German-language newspapers, published specifically for POW camps. These papers, produced under American supervision, provided information carefully calibrated to demoralize without descending into obvious propaganda. They reported German military setbacks. They reported the scale of Allied material superiority. They reported civilian suffering in German cities. They also reported decent treatment of German prisoners in America, contrasting it implicitly with reports of harsh conditions in German camps holding Allied prisoners. Hartmann read these papers with the critical eye of a man trying to separate truth from manipulation. Some reports were obviously true. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing into Germany from west and east. Other reports felt designed to break German morale, suggestions that resistance was futile, that the war was lost, that surrender represented the only rational choice. But the material evidence supported even the psychological warfare. If Germany still possessed the capacity to win, why were millions of its soldiers sitting in camps around the world while Allied forces occupied German territory? In February, the camp received new prisoners from the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last major offensive in the West had failed catastrophically. These new prisoners brought fresh accounts of Allied material superiority. One panzer commander described watching American artillery respond to German positions within minutes of being spotted. The Americans had ammunition to spare, he said. They fired shells like men throwing rocks at cans. German artillery, by contrast, rationed every round. Fire discipline was not tactics, but necessity. Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe pilot who had flown until his squadron literally ran out of fuel, described the sky over Germany as an American domain. German fighters could still rise to intercept, but they did so in inadequate numbers with insufficient training and barely enough fuel for one mission. American fighters, by contrast, ranged across Germany at will, strafing trains and vehicles, engaging any German aircraft they encountered, providing escort for bomber streams so large they darkened the sky. The pilot had been shot down by a P-51 Mustang on what he knew would likely be his last mission. His squadron had started the war with 12 aircraft. By the time he was shot down, only 4 remained operational, and those 4 had no fuel for coordinated operations. These accounts confirmed what Hartmann had suspected since watching the baseball game in July. Germany had lost the industrial war before the shooting war began. The only question remaining was how long the agony would last and how many would die before the inevitable conclusion. In March, the letters from his mother stopped arriving. Hartmann told himself this meant nothing. Mail service was disrupted. Censors were overwhelmed. The chaos of Germany's collapse made regular correspondence impossible. But he knew. The statistics were clear enough. 300,000 German civilians dead from bombing. 7.5 million rendered homeless. His mother's neighborhood in Essen, in the heart of the Ruhr industrial region, had been targeted repeatedly since 1943. The Krupp works where his father had worked were rubble. The city itself was rubble. His mother's silence spoke volumes. April brought news that Americans could no longer suppress the concentration camps. The prisoners at Camp Trinidad learned of Buchenwald and Dachau through tightly controlled information sessions. Camp commanders showed photographs and films documenting what Allied forces had discovered. The images defied comprehension. Skeletal prisoners, mass graves, industrial facilities designed for murder. The German prisoners reacted with shock, denial, shame. Hartmann felt all three simultaneously. How could this be real? How could he not have known? What did it mean that he had fought for a regime capable of such horror? The psychological transformation was total. Pride in military service curdled into complicity. Every order he had followed, every mission he had undertaken, now carried the taint of association with systematic atrocity. The Americans running the camp watched the prisoners process this information with what seemed like satisfaction. Here was moral justification for everything: the bombing, the invasion, the total war. Germany had forfeited any claim to mercy or consideration. Whatever happened next was earned consequence. In early May, the camp received word that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the announcement read by the camp commander through an interpreter. Silence followed. No cheers, no tears, just silence. The war was over, and Germany was destroyed, and they were alive and safe in Colorado, while everything they had known ceased to exist. Hartmann sat alone that night, trying to inventory his losses. His country was occupied and partitioned. His city was ruins. His mother was almost certainly dead, though confirmation might take years if it came at all. His father's fate remained unknown. His younger brother's fate remained unknown. The Germany he had grown up in, the Germany of the 1930s with its economic recovery and national pride, however poisonous its source, was gone. What would rise from the ruins remained to be seen. The baseball season at Camp Trinidad began again in June. The American Guards organized teams. They invited German prisoners to form their own team for exhibition matches. Hartmann declined initially. The idea of playing games while Germany lay in ruins felt obscene, but other prisoners accepted. They argued that refusing accomplished nothing. They argued that life continued regardless of historical catastrophe. They argued that the alternative to playing was to sit in barracks descending into despair. Hartmann attended a game in July, 1 year almost to the day since his first baseball experience. He understood the rules better now. He could follow the strategy and tactics. He watched a German team play an American team with good-natured competition that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The Germans won in extra innings, scoring a run on a hit by a former Luftwaffe mechanic who had learned the game from scratch in the camp. The Americans congratulated them genuinely. After the game, both teams shared cold beer and talked in pidgin English and German about the match. Hartmann stayed on the sidelines, unable to cross the threshold into this new reality. But he understood something he had not understood before. The baseball games were not frivolous. They were not propaganda. They were a statement of civilizational confidence so profound it required no articulation. America could afford to treat defeated enemies as potential friends because America's victory was so complete that generosity cost nothing and risked nothing. The statistics supported this interpretation. The United States had produced 300,000 military aircraft during the war while maintaining civilian prosperity. American factories had built tanks, ships, vehicles, and weapons in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production combined. American agriculture had fed not only American forces, but also Allied nations through Lend-Lease. And America had done all of this while treating 425,000 German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards that specified comfort and dignity. The juxtaposition between German suffering and American abundance was not accidental. It was intentional strategy. Break the enemy's will by demonstrating that resistance is futile because the material disparity is too vast to overcome. The bombing campaign had destroyed German cities and industrial capacity. The POW treatment program demonstrated that America could afford to be generous even to enemies because the resource base was effectively infinite. Hartmann began to understand this as a kind of education. The Americans wanted German prisoners to return home, carrying stories of American power and American decency. They wanted future German civilians to know that resistance had been hopeless from the start, that the outcome had been determined by industrial capacity rather than military valor. The lesson was clear: never again challenge American interests because the resource disparity makes defeat inevitable and the consequences total. Repatriation began in stages throughout 1946. The youngest prisoners went first, then the sick and injured, then the rest, according to a schedule that reflected shipping availability and conditions in occupied Germany. Hartmann's turn came in October of 1946, more than 2 years after his capture. He boarded a Liberty ship in New York Harbor along with hundreds of other former prisoners. The ship's hold was crowded but not uncomfortable. The food was adequate. The crossing took 2 weeks. They landed in Bremen, a city Hartmann barely recognized from pre-war visits. The harbor facilities were damaged but operational. British occupation forces processed them through a reception center that felt more like a relief station than a military facility. They received papers identifying them as former Wehrmacht personnel, a designation that carried uncertain implications in occupied Germany. They received ration cards for the British zone. They received permission to travel within certain restrictions. Hartmann took a train toward Essen, uncertain what he would find. The journey covered distances that would have taken hours before the war, but now consumed days due to damaged track and limited service. The landscape passing outside the train window looked like the surface of the moon. Cities were shells, villages were rubble, industrial. Facilities were twisted metal and broken concrete. Germany had been destroyed as thoroughly as any nation in history, and Hartmann had witnessed none of it, safe in Colorado playing baseball and eating turkey dinners. Essen was worse than he had imagined. The city centre no longer existed in any meaningful sense. His family's apartment building was rubble. His neighbours' buildings were rubble. The street itself was barely passable through debris. He stood at what had been his address and felt nothing. The capacity for grief had been exhausted. A woman approached him, elderly and ragged. She asked if he was looking for someone. He gave his mother's name. The woman shook her head. The building had taken a direct hit in a raid in March of 45, she said. Everyone inside had died instantly. The bodies had been buried in a mass grave in the city cemetery. No individual markers. Too many dead for individual burials. Hartmann thanked her and walked away. He spent 3 days searching for information about his father and brother. The Red Cross had lists, incomplete and outdated. His father's name appeared on a casualty roster from the Eastern Front, killed in action in Lithuania in the summer of 44. His brother's name appeared on another list, died in service with an anti-aircraft battery defending Hamburg in February of 45. He was alone. His family was gone. His city was gone. His country was occupied and divided. Everything that had existed before the war was memory only. And he had survived by becoming a prisoner, by watching baseball games and eating American food while the world he knew burned. The psychological reckoning took years. Hartmann settled in the British zone, finding work rebuilding what the war had destroyed. He married eventually, a woman who had lost her own family to the bombing. They rebuilt lives from fragments. They did not speak often of the war. What was there to say? Germany had chosen catastrophe and received it in full measure. But sometimes, on summer evenings, Hartmann would hear children playing, and the sound would remind him of the crack of a bat hitting a ball. He would remember sitting in Colorado sunshine watching Americans play their incomprehensible game. He would remember the cognitive dissonance of being well-fed and safe while his world ended. He would remember learning, slowly and painfully, that wars are won not on battlefields but in factories, not by soldiers but by production managers and logistics officers who can deliver overwhelming material superiority to the front lines while simultaneously treating defeated enemies to baseball games and turkey dinners. The lesson had been expensive. 300,000 German civilians dead from bombing, 30,000 Allied aircrew dead delivering those bombs, cities reduced to rubble, a civilization shattered and rebuilt under occupation. But the lesson was learned. Germany would not fight another world war. The cost of challenging American industrial might had been demonstrated beyond any possibility of doubt. Hartmann lived until 1983. He never returned to America, though he followed American news with interest throughout his life. He watched the Cold War unfold, watched American prosperity expand, watched American power project itself globally. He understood in ways that Americans themselves often did not, that American dominance rested on the same foundation that had won the Second World War: industrial capacity so vast it permitted simultaneous displays of destructive power and casual generosity. He told his children about the war rarely, and about the POW camp even more rarely. The memories carried too much complexity. How could he explain that his captivity had been more comfortable than his mother's freedom? How could he convey the psychological shock of being treated well by enemies while allies suffered? How could he describe the moment he understood that his country had lost not because of military failure but because of economic impossibility? But late in life, when his grandchildren asked about the war, he would sometimes mention the baseball games. He would describe sitting in Colorado sunshine watching Americans play. He would try to explain the cognitive dissonance, the guilt, the slow recognition that abundance itself was a weapon. The grandchildren would listen politely, unable to fully grasp what he was trying to communicate. How could they? They had grown up in a rebuilt Germany, prosperous and democratic, integrated into a Western alliance system that made another European war unthinkable. Perhaps that was the point. The baseball games, the good treatment, the demonstration of power through generosity, all of it had been designed to ensure that the generation after Hartmann's would grow up understanding that challenging American power was futile and unnecessary. The strategy had worked. Germany rebuilt as an ally rather than an enemy. The lesson had been learned, though the cost of teaching it had been measured in hundreds of thousands of lives and the rubble of an entire civilization. Hartmann died thinking of baseball and bombs, of summer afternoons in Colorado and winter nights in Essen cellars. He died understanding that he had witnessed a turning point in history, the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion, total victory for the side with total industrial supremacy, total defeat for the side that dared to challenge it. The scorecard was simple. 50,000 American bombers pounding Germany into submission while German prisoners of war watched baseball games in America, the arithmetic of power rendered in concrete terms that no propaganda could obscure and no military valor could overcome. The final accounting remains stark. 12,731 B-17 flying fortresses built, 18,493 B-24 Liberators built, nearly 100,000 American bombers of all types produced between 1942 and 1945, 2.7 million tons of bombs dropped on Germany, 3.6 million German dwellings destroyed, and 425,000 German prisoners held in camps across America, many of them learning that their enemies could afford to be generous because victory was never in doubt. Hartmann's life became a footnote to this larger narrative. One prisoner among hundreds of thousands, one survivor among millions of casualties, one witness to the transformation of warfare from military art to industrial equation. His story mattered not because it was unique, but because it was typical. Across Germany, millions of survivors carried similar memories of the moment. They understood that their civilization had challenged power it could not match, and paid the predictable price. The baseball games continued long after the prisoners went home. American servicemen stationed in occupied Germany played through the late 1940s and into the 50s. German children watched and learned the rules. Some took up the sport themselves. The cultural transmission was organic, unremarkable, inevitable. American power manifested not only in military force but in the quiet adoption of American pastimes by former enemies who understood, consciously or not, that resistance to American influence was as futile as resistance to American bombers had been. This was the hidden lesson of the POW camps. Treat defeated enemies well, and they return home as potential allies. Demonstrate that American power permits generosity, and the defeated understand that cooperation offers better outcomes than confrontation. The strategy required resources that only America possessed enough bombers to destroy enemy capacity, while enough surplus remained to maintain comfort for prisoners. The gap between American capability and Axis capability was the war's decisive factor. Everything else was detail. Hartmann understood this by the end. The baseball games had been his education in modern power. Not military power, he had experienced that directly at Normandy. But industrial power, the kind that permits simultaneous destruction and generosity, the kind that makes victory inevitable and defeat absolute. He had learned the lesson watching Americans hit a ball with a stick while 50,000 bombers made his homeland into memory and ash. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.